Wanted to talk a little bit about this point of how to teach children math, specifically because I had someone reach out to me recently, asking me, for some perspective on how to support their kids. They had it's like a younger child and a somewhat older child. I don't remember exactly, but like 5 and 12 or something like that. Um, so I just thought I'd give some perspective that you can apply, whether your child is very young, uh, or whether they're an older child already. Of course, I'll explain, the subtle differences between those two. But I was looking at this book earlier that I've probably read this a million times, but um, there was some pretty cool quotes in here, and I thought I would share those with you, just a few of them to kind of get the ball rolling. But there's a quote in here by Leo Tolstoy, which says that the chapter is called "Never Too Early," but the quote says, "From the child of 5 to myself is but a step, but from the newborn baby to the child of 5 is an appalling distance." And I'm just going to read a little bit here of this because I want to really drive some points home that'll support everybody within how to best support a child to learn math. And then I'm going to give some more perspective after I read a little bit. It says, "Children are born to be smart. In their earliest years, they are like sponges, easily absorbing immense volumes of information about the wonderful world around them. It's tempting, however, for parents to adopt the view that schooling begins at school," and he puts schooling in quotes, "and that these first few formative years of life are nothing more than play years. They couldn't be more wrong." I just realized I don't need those headphones. A growing body of research shows that it is during the first 5 or 6 years of life that some 50% of the brain's nerve cells are connected, the foundation upon which all future learning will be based. There are vital windows of opportunity during these years when exposure to a wide variety of skills is an absolute essential because a baby has billions of neurons just waiting to be wired into a mind. Um, and then they show some different points, and then I'll just read this point here. It says, uh, "Parents are the most important teachers. The home, not the school, is the most significant learning environment, and it's vital, therefore, to provide a rich, stimulating home life right from the start." Um, so that's just kind of a preface to how I'm going to describe the point. But just to give you some background for those of you who, many of you probably know this, but some of you don't. I was a private tutor for like over 15 years. Working basically part-time to full-time hours during that period of tutoring mostly students in high school, college, but I did tutor quite a few, younger students like elementary and middle school and so forth. But primarily it was the high school and then some in college. And so I kind of, during that period, saw mostly the students who were, um, for the most part, like 95% of the cases, like did not have an effective math ability, and that was why they needed the tutor. There was obviously the cases where you have a student where like the parents are really competitive and they want the kid to get into Yale or something like that. And in that case, generally they have a pretty good foundation, but they still want like that little extra edge or something. But that was kind of the rare cases usually. Um, and most of the time, these kids were in private schools more often than not with the students that I tutored. And I could see there was not a lot I could do as a tutor per se. And when I say as a tutor, I mean sitting and talking to the student and explaining things and showing them things from that perspective. There wasn't a lot I could do to impact their ability to learn math. Yes, I was pretty good at showing them the little uh, tricks, but not just tricks, like explaining things in a way where they could do better in their class. But the thing is, like, that's mostly just memorization. It The way school is structured, it's not set up on actually testing your real abilities. It's just memorization. It's just and that may be hard to understand with math because you're thinking, well, you have to be able to solve the problem. But the thing is, there's no and I'm talking, 99% of the case. Like I'm sure there's some exceptions to this. At some schools they might have some points where the children are encouraged to be creative, but that's very rare. So, the vast majority of what people are going to experience going through school is you're shown how to do something, you're told the steps, and then you're given examples that are very similar to what you've already seen, and then you're just repeating that. Um, and so the students who are good at just memorizing what to do when they're presented with something that's familiar, they're the ones who are going to excel. The problem with that is if you go into higher levels of math, I mean, an actual mathematician, for example, that's not what they do. They're looking creatively at problems and trying to figure out the solutions to things that don't already exist, generally speaking. There's also applied mathematics where you're taking stuff and you're applying it, but then you're applying it to a problem, where you're using mathematics to help you solve that problem. So it may not be a mathematical problem, it might be a real world problem that you're using mathematics within. But again, that problem has not been solved yet. Otherwise, why would you be doing it? I'm talking about in the terms of having a career or something like that. You're not going to be paid to solve something that has already been solved. So, and obviously that point applies generally speaking within most fields, with the exception of going to get a job where you're just repeating some kind of repetitive task. So you have this sort of point where you would think, well, it might, what does it matter if my kid actually learns mathematics? Because they're going to go get a job where they're just going to be repeating stuff anyways, or memorizing things and repeating them, or they're going to be told what to do on the job. It's got nothing to do with mathematics. And then my question will be, well, then why are you even learning mathematics in school at all? And I'm not promoting learning mathematics in school because I'm not promoting school, but there must be some value to it, right? So here's the value that I see. The value of mathematics is yes, being able to take math and solve problems that would require math, but it's beyond just that. It's also being able to think mathematically, to be able to solve problems mathematically. So that doesn't just mean using math. It means thinking about things in a logical way, thinking about things also in a creative way where you're putting information together to solve a problem. That is actually mathematics. So there's a lot that you might do in your life that is mathematics. You may not realize it, and you'll either be limited or not, depending on your ability to think um, logically based on the rules of the logic of what you're trying to do. So if you're, you know, and part of the problem is if you're trying to solve a problem and you the way in which you think the thing you're trying to solve works, if that's not physically correct, if it's not how it actually works in reality, you're never going to be able to solve the problem. Um, I mean, you can see how that would play out in a lot of politics and so forth, where you have people who you are trying to solve a problem in your life or in the world, but the premises upon which you're trying to solve it are not in accordance with actual reality. So even if you're logical within that, you're still not going to get the right answer. So there's two aspects to mathematics. There's having premises that are correct and based in actual physical reality, but then there's being able to see the relationships between those things and apply them in a way where you're not putting a bias into it and therefore getting an incorrect answer or incorrect solution, even though your premises were correct. So where does that start? Because if you're waiting until school to do it, it's too late. And now, unfortunately, you have a big movement of people who are, whether they call it this or not, it's kind of like, it kind of gets wrapped up into this term called unschooling. And I've talked about this before, where it's like, well, school is so rigid and stultifying, and you know, I fucking hated school. You have all kinds of people who have reactions to it, and also there's definitely some valid criticisms of school and the structure of school. Um, the least of which would be, well, it's not preparing your child really fundamentally for the reality of today. because it was created hundreds of years ago, the model that's used, and it has not adapted to, well, what do children actually need to be able to do in the information age as we're going into the knowledge age. So those criticisms are valid, but what happens is people then say, well, then I'm just not going to teach my kid anything. They're going to learn it all naturally through playing and stuff. But you don't learn mathematics purely through playing, because how you play is dependent upon your understanding of reality in the first place, right? Because you could say, I'm going to play, but then you just play a video game. Or I'm going to play and I'm just going to play in the mud. Not that there's anything wrong with either of those things per se, but playing doesn't equal suddenly the child's going to be creative. They're going to play within the context of, I mean, think about it. If you take a child who's been raised on watching cartoons and Spider-Man movies and all that stuff, and then you put them with another child or by themselves, what are they going to play? They're going to play Spider-Man or whatever thing they've been watching. So they're going to play and express based on the inputs that were put into them. So mathematics is the same thing. When you get to school, you're going to perform in mathematics based on, one, your ability to memorize, and two, if you already have been supported, maybe even not on purpose by your parents, but just because they had the vocabulary, they had a mathematical ability, you'll be supported to think in those terms. So then when you get to something like math, you'll kind of naturally be able to do it better than your peers, but that's because the foundation was already set within you. So what is that foundation? Well, when you think about math, sometimes, when we talk about math as just vocabulary, people have a hard time wrapping their mind around that, because there's this divide, and uh, it's a false divide in our minds. And I can't really say whether it's deliberate or not, but it definitely serves the interests of a system that is based on inequality. But there's a divide of, what we would call, language and expression and artistic creativity, those types of things, and science and math. And then even math you might think is separate from science, but they're really all just different vocabulary sets. Because if for example, if you write essays in literature class, you still have to think in a logical way. You have to form a hypothesis, which they call a thesis. It's got the word thesis in hypothesis. You form a thesis, which is points of information, and then you argue in a certain way, in a certain expressive way, based on that thesis to a conclusion, right? And so you're still applying a logic to it. So you're still thinking mathematically in a certain way. And so even though a person who writes a lot of literature essays may not think that they're good at math, that's simply because they don't have that vocabulary. And there is some nuance and subtle difference between the two. It's not like they're just exactly the same, but at the end of the day, it's a different vocabulary set. And no matter what vocabulary set you're working within, you still have to be logical within it. And you could say, well, literature is highly just expressive and creative, but there's a logic to it. Even writing a book, you think you can just sit down and write it and just be creative, but it doesn't have certain elements that are required for someone to find it entertaining or interesting or captivating, or whatever the case may be. There is a logic to it, whether the person is consciously aware that that's what they're doing or not. Right? But there's theory of writing, for example, and you can take courses on it and so forth. That shows that there is a logic and a structure to it, right? Mathematics is really not fundamentally different. It's just that I would say to a large degree, um, because we have emotional resistances to math by and large, we see it as something special because some people are good at it and some people aren't. That evidence becomes, oh, it's obviously this its own thing that's totally separate from all other subjects, right? But it's just another vocabulary set, right? Just because you're very good at history doesn't mean you're going to be good at writing essays, even though both of those are more on the language side from the context of what you learn in school, right? They're different things. Um, so with math, if you think about it, the most basic points of math are just the numbers themselves, because everything else flows from that. if you didn't know the numbers, it would be very difficult to count, well, it'd be impossible to count. It'd be you okay, let's just look at the things you wouldn't be able to do. You wouldn't be able to count. You wouldn't be able to say how many things are in a group of objects. You wouldn't really effectively, easily be able to compare the size of objects, especially when there's a very similar close number. Because, if you had 15 things here and 14 things here in a group, how would you know which one has more? You wouldn't if you couldn't count, because you would have to really, I mean, there'd be other ways, like you could weigh them. I understand that. But in terms of just seeing right off the bat, if this quantity is greater than that, you would lose count before you could remember, okay, wait, what was I at here? But you wouldn't be counting in the first place. So there's some very basic perceptual type things that you won't be able to do. Even understanding whether something is greater or less than, having a basic understanding of numbers helps you in that process. Counting, obviously being able to add, subtract, multiply, divide, very basic things that you don't really have to go far outside of into like advanced math to see the practicality of having a strong mathematical ability, just in terms of arithmetic, like adding, subtracting, multiplying, dividing, fractions, decimals, things like that, comparing numbers, being able to count, being able to just do those very basic things that really you should have mastered before you even get into school. Or at least around that age, you should be developing mastery towards even multiplication. And if you think about it, multiplication is just addition, right? It's just a shortcut to addition. Like 5 times 5, or let's say 5 times 3, you can get there just by going 5 plus 5 plus 5. So if you have a strong addition background, it becomes a lot easier to understand multiplication. And if you don't, what happens, which is what happens to most of us in school, is we just, even though maybe we're told these things, we still don't really grasp it. And then we just are like, okay, I just have to memorize 5 times 3 is 15. 5 times 3 is 15. So imagine if you had a hard time memorizing, like you didn't have just this really easy ability to memorize. And so you're like on your test going 5 times 4 is 15, or I think, or what is it? And the teacher's like, no, that's 20. And you're like, ah, but it's just because you can't remember it. It's not because you're stupid. I mean, you are in the sense that you don't know why, but imagine if you're on the test and yes, I understand maybe there's a timing aspect, so this might slow you down, but imagine if you could say, well, I can't remember what 5 times 4 is, but let's see, it's 4 5s, so 5 and 5 is 10, and another 5 is 15, and then another 5 is 20. Okay, it's 20. So imagine taking a test with somebody and they can do all their multiplication tables, and the teacher says, okay, so why is 7 times 6 54? Or not 7 times 6, 9 times 6 54. And they're like, uh, because that's what it is. And it's like, but why? How do you know you're right? How do you know if your memory is correct? But a child who's taught 9 times, was it 6, is 54, can say, well, and, in fact, I'll give you an example, right? Our son Max, he turned 6 in October, so he's a little over 6 now. Doesn't go to school, um, and we were at dinner the other night, and I'm trying to remember why we were talking about this. I mean, we're always talking about these things, but at some point we were talking about math, and um, I think we were just going back and forth. I was giving math question to Seneca, and I was giving one to Max that was more at his current level, and I said 9 times. I want to say it was like 9 times 7. Right? And he looked at it for a moment and he was like 63. And I was like, wow, I didn't know you knew those yet. Right? Because we've been encouraging him that although he's developing, he can add, subtract very easily now. Um, and I can go into more of that later, but uh, I've been encouraging him, hey, it also is useful to have these multiplication points, like what we call the multiplication table, memorized. So I'm not against memorizing. What I'm suggesting is that you don't put an overemphasis on that at the expense of actually understanding. But then once you understand, there's certain sums, certain multiplication facts, let's say, that are going to come up quite often that would be useful just to know them without having to do the thinking it through. So we focus on the thinking it through, and then we get to the point of just know it, right? And so he's been working a little bit on doing that with his multiplication facts, and I think up through like at least up through the fives, he knows those without having to think about it, and I'm sure he's even beyond that at some point because Katie keeps more track of where he's at with all the specific details. So I might kind of have a general idea, but I don't know exactly where he's at right now. And I was kind of surprised. Like at dinner, I was like, "Wow, you knew seven. You knew what was it, 9 times 7?" And I was like, "Did you just know it, or how did you know? Like, how did you know?" And he goes, "Well, I couldn't remember what it was, but I just thought about 10 times 7, and I knew that was 70." And he said, "I also knew that, and so I knew that was 10 away uh, from, what was he saying? He was saying, okay, so I knew that 10 times 7 was 70. And he said, I'm trying to remember how he phrased it. He said something to the effect of like, I knew that uh, 7, oh, because it would have been, okay, yeah. So 10 times 7 he knew was 70. That was something that it's easy to know, right? That's something he's, let's say, memorized, even though he understands why. And so he could get to that quickly. And then he said, well, obviously I'm 7 off because I did 10 times 7, not 9 times 7. And he said, I knew that 7 plus 3 is 10. He said, so that means 3 plus 7 is 10. So if I just take away 7, then I have 63. And I mean, what's fascinating about it is if you were sitting there, you would have assumed that he had memorized it. That's why I was like, oh, I didn't know you already knew those ones. Because we've been working on it recently, and I was encouraging him, hey, get to the point where you can do your nines and your tens and your, eights, 8 times 7, 7 times 6, those numbers as well, where you can kind of just know it, right? So he's building towards that. So I was like, wow, he knows 9 times 7, okay. But I asked him like, how did you know it? And he just describes that whole mental process he went through. And but when it was in real time, him giving me the answer, it was like, how did he do that quickly? I mean, I'm not surprised that he could, but I'm saying if I think objectively, if just a random person was watching, they would have been like, oh, he had that memorized. But then when he explained, no, I didn't memorize it. I don't have that one memorized, but here's how I arrived at the conclusion. He did all of that so quickly in his mind. And so you might want to know, like, how did we get to that point, right? Because number one, and this is kind of why I went to like the point about the children in the first 5 years being like these sponges. What, you could call it the cutting edge of understanding, but that's the most important time to put the symbols into a child's memory structure. And I know some of that statement might be over some people's heads, right? But you're if you think about it, um, in the example where we did 9 times 7, even though he hadn't memorized 9 times 7 yet, he does know 7 plus 3 is 10, and he does know 7 times 10 is 70. He knows those things like that. So when you have a firm grasp, like let's say the basic point of, let's say you have something you're looking at, something you're trying to figure out, and that's composed of a bunch of parts. And if those basic parts are solid within you as memories, meaning they're in your structure of your memory, you can recall them immediately. It's like you have immediate access to it. Then you don't have to sit here and spend a lot of mental energy on those details of trying to figure those out, because you need to think about, well, how do I put those together to get the bigger point? So if you're trying to put your mental energy on the 3 plus 7, it's like you only have so much, like on a computer you have RAM. It's kind of like the memory that it's using in the moment. It's not its long-term memory, it's the short-term memory. So if you have to use the RAM and you have only so much, if you have to use that to figure out the 3 plus 7, and imagine even the 3 and the 7 are not solid within you, right? It's like we use this example or this analogy of a brick wall. And imagine in this brick wall, which you're either sitting on or placing things on, the bricks themselves are not really solid in there. They're very weak, or they're like crumbled, or they're not, the mortar's not done properly in there, so they're kind of like shaky. I mean, just build a brick wall with no mortar and where the bricks are all broken and cracked, like you'll see it's a very weak structure, versus if they're all very solid and you put the mortar properly, right? It's the same thing when you have letters and numbers. Those are like the most basic units of the words, which become, when you start putting those words together, an entire concept or idea. Like if you ask me, um, you know, some concept in calculus, I would start describing it in words. And if you ask me, what does that word mean? I would describe it with words until I would get back to the point of, let's say, a number, which is a symbol, right? Or a group of symbols. So, and then even if you just stay at the level of words, those are composed of the letters. And so this is also why uh, what we do is superior to phonics. It's also superior to any other approach because those are all based on sort of a memorization process where you're thinking about it and trying to put it together in the moment rather than just knowing it, which sounds like a contradiction because I'm saying don't just memorize it. But the reason why the memorization doesn't work at the level of learning math in school is because the basic points are not solid. They're not actually in your memory. And so, how do you then take a child who's before the age where you can explain things like in the level you can to a 12-year-old, hypothetically, how do you then get them to learn things and understand concepts before they're even able to read and recognize anything? It's very challenging. The key is to make sure you have those symbols in solidly. And then so everything that you go to, when you go to the next point, instead of having to memorize it, it just becomes an obvious thing to you. And then it integrates into your memory more effectively versus trying to artificially memorize it. And this is where the real problem of school, although there's many problems with it, but it's one of the main problems with it is, like I said in this book when I read it earlier, it said it's tempting, however, for parents to adopt the view that schooling begins at school because, and it says, and that these first few formative years of life are nothing more than play years. There's nothing wrong with playing. In fact, my kids spend most of their time playing, but we do very specific things using TechnoTutor each day to make sure that those little bricks in that wall are very solid. So when we have a new concept to introduce to them, whether it's in mathematics or whether it's something about something they're learning, maybe it's some life lesson or some piece of wisdom that we're giving them or some way to resolve a conflict or to understand something, right? They're the words and the symbols are so solid within them that they don't have to spend any extra effort within themselves to understand the words I'm saying. They're just listening to the concept that the words are explaining. So you look at school, and what's going on is the teacher's using a bunch of words. Those words are kind of like not clear within you, so you're trying to catch up. Like, oh, what was that? What did that word mean? Or you just don't even. A lot of times it's totally sub or unconscious. You don't realize it's happening. You just don't understand what someone's saying. But as everything is more and more solid, you'll see like, okay, that just makes sense. A perfect example of that is anyone who's tried to learn a new language, like as an adult especially, or even like when you're in school and you take like a Spanish class or something like that, and you're trying to keep up with every word the person's saying, and just because it's not there solid within you, it just doesn't make sense. Versus right now, most likely right now when I'm talking, you're understanding the general picture of what I'm saying. Now, there may be some that you don't. Like when I say something like having the words solid within your memory structure, problem with it is what do you understand by the meaning of the words memory structure? And has your understanding of those words been tainted by like some kind of images or some kind of ideas you have from some limited presentation of those words to you through the media or through school or some other form. And so when I'm using those words, you may not be understanding what I'm saying. And it's not an insult to your intelligence, it's because you don't have the clear definition of those words within you. So when I say it, it's like if someone's saying that to me, I'm not hesitating at all. I'm not thinking. I'm not confused. And I'm not saying you even are confused about what I'm saying. You may actually think you understand when you don't. And again, that comes down to are those words really solidly in there and not just the structure of the word in your memory, but the meaning of the word, which is other words. So you can see how if you have some words within you that are not structured properly, or some numbers, which are just symbols, right, are not structured in there properly, then when you try to add something to it, there's a lack of confidence. There's a shakiness. There's also just a maybe you don't even experience a lack of confidence, but there's a not clear understanding. And when I say clear understanding, I mean you can think that you're understanding something, right? Like I could sit here and give a lecture on how to take apart an engine or a motor of a car, And you can think that you're understanding it, but then when you try to do it, you put things incorrectly, even though you're thinking that you're applying your understanding, but your understanding is incorrect. And so there's a difference between actually understanding and then having the belief that you understand, right? Um, you know, when we talk about, and it's kind of going off topic a little bit, but when we talk about other topics that might seem unrelated to this, but things like God, for example, or spirituality, people will misunderstand us. Like when I say something like, there is no God, suddenly they're like, oh, therefore you are an atheist, or therefore you believe in the devil, or therefore you think that blah, blah, blah. It's like, you didn't understand what that word meant. And have you really critically looked at what is that word? What does that word mean actually? And what does it mean to different people? And what are the implications of the word? And how is that word lived in our world? And I will also say there is God. God does exist, but just not in the way that anybody really thinks it exists because they're misunderstanding the meaning of the word. So, not to go totally off topic, but it's another example where people will um, think that they're understanding something, but actually what they're doing is filtering it through their bias, through their definitions, and a lot of times then just reacting to a point. That's what happens in mathematics and when you're in school. You're thinking you're understanding it, or maybe you don't think you're understanding it, but you're not fully comprehending it, and then you're reacting to it. And usually what happens is, you might relate to this. It just depends on the person, but a lot of people expressed to me that they really started disliking math either when it came to learning the times tables because they just couldn't memorize it fast enough, to the standard the teacher wanted, and so they got shamed in some way from that. Also, another one is that's very common is when you started learning fractions in school, and that was very difficult, and there was some shame and stuff around that because you couldn't understand it, and then it's just like everything kind of went downhill from there because like even basic algebra, like if you were to solve a problem like x plus 4 equals 7, right? Which if you subtract the 4 from 7, you get 3. So obviously 3 plus 4 is 7, right? That's very simple. But then if I said, let's say 3x plus 2 equals 7. Okay, well, that would be 5 over 3. So if I subtract the 2 from the 7, I get 5. And if I divide by the 3 on the x, I get 5 over 3. So the answer to, if I'm remembering it correctly, what did I say? 3x plus 2 equals 7. The solution to that is 5/3. That's what x is. But if you have within you an emotional reaction to fractions, not because there's anything wrong with fractions, but because your experience within learning them was difficult, you may in that moment have not followed what I was saying or even been like, oh, and some of you may not. It just depends on your experience, your specific experience. But those experiences are memories now because you're not experiencing what happened back then. And so that experience led to either developing the effective memory, which is how to look at a fraction, understand a fraction, or it led to instead a not understanding of it and therefore an emotional reaction to the word fraction or to the concept or the use of them. Or anytime you're in an environment where it's a part of your interaction, you will go into the emotional reaction based on that memory. And so one point to look at within what I'm discussing is this isn't just about, oh, you just got to teach your kid a bunch of math when they're little, because how you teach it to them, whether it's just the numbers or concepts or whatever, and how you interact with them is also going to influence their emotional memory towards those things. And so if you're trying to get your kid to learn the numbers by talking to them, showing them things, there's like an element of hope, like eventually maybe they'll get it. And how do you know if they really did? How do you know if, for example, if I take all the numbers, or let's just say all the digits 0 through 9, which is what we use in our mathematics system generally, right? 0 through 9. And how do I know that your child or my child can, like, how do you know your child can effectively process the visual picture of all of those numbers equally effectively? And as efficiently as physically possible? How do you know that it's optimized for each of those? How do you know when your child looks at the number 17 versus 21 that they're processing those numbers individually and as a whole in the most effective, optimized way? And this is a part of education that is not considered at all in school. And it's certainly not considered by parents, generally speaking, either, because they're not even aware that that's a point. Even though, if you think about it logically, I mean, think about how a computer works. There's information in there, and if the computer can't access it as efficiently as possible, it slows you down. That's why you'll notice sometimes when you're using your computer, everything starts to get like a little bit crazy and or crazy. Um, it starts to slow down. You click on stuff, it's like not working, and then finally it clicks later, and you're like, ah, yeah, restart my computer. It's like it's not using the information, it's not accessing the information efficiently, and it's getting overloaded, and it starts to shut down. That's the same experience that you have if you're one of these people, for example, who has trouble with fractions. That's the experience you're having. You're not able to efficiently access those things, and it probably is much deeper than just fractions. Because why couldn't you process what fractions were? Part of it could be that when you were in school, they were just like, here's what it is. They explained it in a certain way, and something about that explanation you didn't process because there was words that were used or concepts that were used that you were not prepared for, which goes back to the foundational years of you with your parents. Like with our kids, um, fractions are not an issue because we start with the basic points. And so by the time we're adding the fractions to it, it's like everything else is so efficiently processed that it's like, oh, okay, so that's what that is. Cool. But their mind is not struggling with the number one or the number two or the word part or the word whole or the word even numerator. Because with TechnoTutor, you can take these points and make sure that it's effectively integrated. And so as a parent, being able to, before you're trying to explain, a lot of times what happens as a parent, what a parent does is they try to explain something to the child, but they're explaining it in a way that they're making so many assumptions about what the child already understands or should understand when it's like, that'd be like getting a brand new computer and then just being, where's Zoom? Come on, Zoom, turn on Zoom. Where's Zoom? Why isn't Zoom working? And I'm like, did you install Zoom? What? It should have Zoom. Zoom should be it should already have Zoom. And it's like, but it doesn't. Right? So that's as a parent, this happens a lot with parents with their kids where it's like, I was getting some food the other day at a restaurant here in town, and as I was heading towards the door, I saw out the window a little 18-month-old, 2-year-old. I don't know how old the kid was, still very young, pre-verbal clearly, like kind of running towards the street, not like at a crazy speed, but ambling towards it. And like this woman was like running up after him and grabbed him right and was clearly very flustered. And she was like, and I held the door open as she came in and brought him inside, set him down in front of the door, like in the doorway, and then went back out. And I was kind of like, am I going to shut the door right now on the child? Do you want, I wasn't really sure, were they trying to let him come back out with them? It was not clear. So I'm in that moment of just kind of observing. And she told the kid, like, come out here, get out here right now. So she had put him inside and then immediately went outside and told him to come back out, which was very weird. And then as I was walking away, I could hear her saying to the child, like, sit down right there. You sit down, and this with this kind of a tone. And like, don't you see all those cars out there? Why are you running out there? You sit down, boy. Don't run out there with those cars. Just like that, right? And I was looking at like how, for example, we prevented those issues from happening with our kids. Because obviously, I'm sure she was in a state of like fear, frustration, anger, all kinds of things coming up. Um, but when your child starts to learn how to walk, or they're getting close to it, that's when you start explaining to them what a car is. Like with our children, for example, we'd be walking with them and not just letting them run off, and we'd be like, hey, okay, I'm going to put you down, but look, let me explain something to you, okay? Do you see like the road here versus the sidewalk? All right, this is the part we walk on, and we can walk in the road, but do you know what else is in the road? Cars. And you see those cars, right? And those cars are very big, right? They're very large. And what happens when something very large, even if it's moving kind of slowly, impacts or hits something very small like our body, or your body especially, it can really damage or hurt you. So if a car hits you, even if it's going slowly, it can really hurt you. Okay, so we have to now become aware, especially because you can walk now, that there's cars that drive in the street, and now that you're small and I'm very large, can you see the difference? Like, look at me compared to you, right? See where the person sits in the car? They can see me more easily, right? But they really can't see you at all. So when we're in a parking lot, right? And when we would be in a parking lot, we would explain that again. Remember, the cars, people driving, they can't see you. So when we're in the parking lot, especially when you're small, stay near us. Don't just start running away, right? And if the kid did run away, like if the child did run away, we'd go grab them and be like, hey, and then we would talk to them. Okay, remember, we can't just run off in the parking lot right now. Versus look at the other example of assuming that the child should already know. So it's like you if you were self-honest with yourself, you know you didn't explain it properly at all, but then now you're getting mad at the child for not knowing. There's a really great audio by Bernard Pullman called uh, I'm pretty sure it's the one called Self-Perfection Not a Myth. I'm only saying that because it's got self-perfection in the title. And in that, I'm pretty sure it's that one, he explains like parents demand perfection from their kids, but they don't explain to them how perfection works or how you develop perfection within something. It's like when I was a tutor, I'd have parents get mad at their kids because I would be showing them, okay, so they were struggling with this point. This is what they didn't understand, and they'd be like, "What? You know this? You know that? Don't you know that, right? You know that? You know that?" And it's like, how do you know they know it? It's like just because you put them in school and they went through algebra, it's like they're assuming they know it, but you didn't actually check. You didn't go through the contents of their mind. It's like me going, Zoom should be on this computer versus, okay, let me go check my applications. Okay, let me see, is Zoom there? Okay, let me click it. Is it installed? Okay, it's installed. So then tomorrow, I should reasonably expect that it's going to be there. And if it wasn't, I'd be like, well, something must have happened, right? Like, why did it get deleted or whatever? But I wouldn't, it's not reasonable to demand that it's there when, no, you didn't even check to make sure it was there. So now imagine doing that for every piece of data on your computer. That's like the letters in a child, just the way in which they learn them. How do you know each letter, each number? And then even beyond that, punctuation symbols, mathematical symbols. Like you show a kid, you tell, okay, for example, you say to a kid, 2 plus 2 is 4, okay? And then they tell you, what is 2 plus, you say 2 plus 2, and they say 4. Cool. And then you write it on a piece of paper, 2 plus 2. Okay, so what is that? And they're like, and you're like, 2 plus 2, what is it? And they're looking at it going like, and then you're like, I just told you. You just told me what it was. And it's like, yeah, but that plus symbol is not the same visually as the word plus. And so you didn't make sure that that plus symbol was integrated into their memory as the word plus, right? And so how can you expect that they should know it? But then there would be a frustration that would come up in a parent because they're not sitting in detail and looking at how all of that connects, how it's all structured. And so this is also a reason why parents would have resistance to educating their kids at home because number one, you're assuming it's done at school, which it's not, and number two, you don't know how all this works. So it's like, well, I'm going to trust and assume that the experts know. But look at the evidence. I mean, we're talking about math specifically on this little video, but it's like, just looking at my frame right here. Look at the school system. Who comes out of there actually understanding math? Except a very small percentage of people who you would probably describe as nerds, geeks, smart people, like whatever. It's like some very small percentage of people who you're going to assume already were prepared somehow for that, or they had some, uh, I don't know what the word is, inclination towards it or something, right? Which is really just an excuse for not understanding the fact that they have that foundation somehow, genetically, epigenetically, meaning from their environment. It's There's certain things a parent can emphasize which supports that development, even though they maybe did it consciously or unconsciously. Now, all of those things are cool, and I do encourage, obviously, you read to your kids, you explain things, you're patient, all of these points. But without TechnoTutor, you're still hoping that all of those that is enough when it's not. Because with our kids, like you look at Max, he's already doing algebra. He can already think in a logical, rational manner way beyond his age, what would should be expected. And it's not because he's special. It's because we've slowly but surely, systematically put in all the points and checked them and made sure that it's like you're building that brick wall in a solid manner. So as you put new things on it, you can reasonably expect that there's not going to be any shakiness, except at that level. And then as those are put in solidly, then you can build and build and build and build. So he has a very well developed sense of like how things work, right? And he has a very well developed sense of also like how to communicate with people. And he doesn't have fear of adults. He will talk to them as equals. And a lot of times that's intimidating for other adults because they're not expecting children to be like that. They would let an adult get away with saying something that he might say to them, but they wouldn't let him as a child, and they would react to it because they have this belief that child should be dumb or the child should be just not at the level of an adult. But they don't realize that the level that you're at as an adult is so limited, actually. You're still a child emotionally, maturationally. The only difference is you have a physical body and you have a certain vocabulary that allows you to be in the world and the system and make money. But by and large, you didn't create any of that. So you have this idea that you're something when really you're just fitting into a system. And then we would treat children in a way that would not allow them to go past us, right? And that's really putting your child into the school system, educating your child at home without really understanding what you're doing. That's all you're doing. You're limiting them, and so they won't go past you. They're not going to go past you without something you didn't have, without taking an approach that wasn't done with you. And just to wrap this up, although obviously I can't go into every amount of detail, I could probably give a 3-week lecture on how to teach math to the kids. But it really starts with the simplicity of it. Starts with using TechnoTutor, building in the very basic fundamental points, and then building from there with TechnoTutor, and then adding explanation. At a certain point, your children will be able to teach themselves, but not if they don't have the intrinsic drive. And where does that come from? It comes from processing the information effortlessly. The reason why I like reading is because it's easy for me. The reason why I like, for example, things that I'm new to, that I'm not good at, I don't like doing it at first. There may be some excitement of doing something new, I still have lots of resistance to the thing itself until I develop the skill, and then it just becomes not a problem. Like there's no resistance to doing it. So it's like that with everything. So don't fool yourself as to, well, my child will just develop an interest in it, and I'll just give them things according to those interests. You can actually develop the interest by setting the foundation properly. Max is not just naturally interested in mathematics. We've set the foundation properly. That's why he's able to do those things. Same with Seneca. When we sit around at dinner and we're talking about math, they're both enjoying it. And they're both very physical kids who like running and playing and doing other things too. They're not bookish. You know what I mean? Like from the perspective of they're just always uh, only focused on an academic type thing. It's like they're very well rounded, but there's no subject matter that we can't discuss that can't become interesting because they have the vocabulary to process. And then we can see when there's a limitation, and then we say, oh, okay, here's what you don't understand. Well, let me explain this. You know what? I realize like this context you don't have and some of these words. Let's do that in our techno tutor, and that'll support, and we can talk about it again, right? So we have a process for that. And just to wrap it up, why is this all so significant? Because whether you're putting your kids in school or whether you're trying to homeschool your kids or whether you're trying to unschool them especially, but let's just say you're trying to homeschool, um, the problem is you only know school. And when you go out there and you look for resources, you're just going to get people who only really know school. Even if it seems like they're doing something different, they're just doing school, just in a different form, and it's just the parent doing it. And you're trying to give them things to learn, but you don't know how to set up the foundation properly so that they can absorb it. It's like imagine your child being able to pick up the math book and read it and learn it and for themselves. And it's not that you can't be involved, but you don't need to be involved, right? I wouldn't suggest that before the first 7 years, but if you build the first 7 years of their knowledge and memory structure properly, symbols, vocabulary, and specific points within Technosphere, if you build that properly, then at a certain point they will be able to teach themselves. And you'll realize they can go way faster than you can spend the time. Like if you have to be their teacher when they're 12, I mean, when they're 12, they should be creating stuff. They should be inventing stuff. They should be developing stuff. Like, do you want a 12-year-old where you're trying to teach them how to paint still, or they've gone beyond the teacher, right? But if you set the foundation properly in the formative years properly, and I'm suggesting you consider Technotutor for that, there will become a point where they'll go way beyond what you would even have the time to take them on. It doesn't mean you can't always be there as a guide. You should be, right, as a point to direct, but that's more than directing within principles. Like, why are you spending your time on this? What is the result you're trying to get? What are the principles through which you're applying this, right? And that would be where the parent would come in, especially at that time, right? So uh, if you have an older child and they're struggling with math, the simple answer to that is because those first years weren't done properly. So they're going to have to go back and redo that. And what's cool is you can use Technotutor to support them with that too. All right. So if you have any questions or interest in those points, obviously let me know. Send me a message and we can talk more. And obviously, I'm making this video specifically for people, even though I'm saying it as if you may not have Technotutor yet, really I'm making this video for people who already do, or for distributors or so forth, or people who are really looking to support other people with education in the best way. Because we're very rapidly, we have been for a while, but now it's becoming very rapidly obvious, entering a world where things like AI and automation are becoming commonplace. And the way in which we're teaching our kids, schooling them, educating them, the way the average person is doing, whether they're in school or homeschooled, is not preparing them for 10, 15, 20 years from now, where the economy is going to be unrecognizable in terms of what are the opportunities available for people. It's going to be unrecognizable, and there can be people who say like, oh, that's just there's going to be new opportunities created and there's going to be new jobs. I agree with that, but they're not going to look like they look now. Not when you have computer programs that can write computer programs, right? Not when you have artificial intelligence that you can talk to and it can give you answers instantaneously and create things for you. You're going to have a whole new level of creativity that you're going to need to be able to access. And so how you communicate with an AI, you don't want to be dumber than the AI, right? And if you develop your child's vocabulary effectively, they will be the master of the AI rather than the other way around. But the current trajectory of our world, we're heading towards a world where there are the slave masters who control the AI and everyone else is the slaves, right? Just look into the World Economic Forum and what the agenda is there. That's exactly what it is, right? So we have a window of opportunity now to prepare a generation or generations of children to really take direction over all of that rather than being the slaves to it, right? So time is of the essence, and I really suggest that you consider these points, all right? And I will see you on the next video. Take care.